You are listening to HOA Consequences. This is the pettiest property line war ever. The string line fluttered in the wind, and Martha screamed that movement proved my fence was unsafe, and she would order removal. If you refuse, I schedule a hearing. She stood inches from my property line with her phone out, and a measuring tape extended like a weapon, the metal tab shaking as she jabbed it toward my fence post. I was halfway through digging the first post hole, with an auger still running in my hands when she showed up. And now she was threatening to call the contractor off the job before I could even finish the foundation work. I am a notary public in Albany, New York, and I keep everything documented, which is why I already had the survey report in my truck and a recording app running in my pocket. I had moved into Survey Ridge HOA Incorporated 3 weeks ago. Bought the place because the price was right, and I needed something close to my office. And within 48 hours of closing, I got my first violation notice about lawn height, even though the grass was barely 2 inches. Martha Phillips is the HOA vice president, and she made it clear from day one that she runs enforcement like a military operation. She wears a pink blazer over a white bucket hat with the hood up most days, carries a crossbody bag stuffed with hardware packets, and a handheld label maker she uses to tag materials as violations. And her catchphrase is burned into my brain because she has said it at least a dozen times already. If you make me repeat myself, it gets more expensive. She said it the first time I asked for clarification on the fence height rule. And she said it again when I requested a copy of the Architectural Committee guidelines in writing. The stakes here are simple and brutal. I just moved in, and I cannot afford to lose the place or get dragged into court, because I used every dollar I had on the down payment and closing costs. And if they slap a lien on me or force a foreclosure, I am finished. The fence install was supposed to be straightforward. I hired a licensed contractor, pulled the city permit, got a property survey from a certified surveyor, and submitted the architectural request to the HOA, with all required documents attached. The rules in the Survey Ridge HOA covenant say fences must be no taller than 6 feet, must match approved styles, and must be set back at least 2 feet from the property line. My fence design was a simple vertical picket style in natural cedar, 5 feet 11 inches tall to stay under the limit, and the survey showed my property line clearly marked with iron pins at each corner. I submitted everything on a Monday and got approved in writing by the Architectural Committee on Thursday. The approval letter said I could proceed as long as I followed the submitted plans. I thought I was golden. I scheduled the contractor for the following weekend, and we started Friday afternoon with post hole digging and layout. That is when Martha showed up. She walked across the lawn with her label maker in one hand and her phone in the other, and she immediately started taking photos of the string line I had stretched between corner stakes to mark the fence alignment. She claimed the string line was 6 inches over the property line and that I was encroaching on HOA common property, which I knew was false because I had watched the surveyor mark the pins, and I had measured twice before placing the stakes. I showed her the survey report right there on my phone, zoomed in on the diagram that showed the iron pins and the setback distance, and she waved it away. She said surveys can be wrong, and that the HOA has its own records that show the boundary differently. I asked her to show me the HOA records, and she refused. She said she did not need to prove anything to me because she is an officer of the board, and her word is sufficient. Then she hit me with the line that would come back to haunt her. I do not need proof. I have paperwork and vibes. She said it with a straight face, as if that was a normal thing to say in a property dispute, and I nodded like I accepted it, because I wanted her comfortable and careless. I had already decided I was going to document every word and every move she made. Because I have been a notary long enough to know that people who say things like that usually have no case at all, and they are relying on intimidation to win. She told me to stop work immediately and wait for a formal hearing to determine whether my fence plan violated the setback rule. I asked when the hearing would be, and she said she would let me know. But she made it clear that if I continued the work before the hearing, I would be fined daily, starting at $500 per day, and escalating. The contractor looked at me with his hands up like he wanted no part of this, and I told him to hold off until I sorted it out. Martha walked away with her phone still out, taking more photos of the string line and the post holes, and I could see her typing notes into her label maker as she crossed back toward her own property. That night, I got an email from the HOA management company with a formal notice of violation. The notice claimed I had begun construction without approval, which was a flat lie because I had the approval letter in my files, and it said I had 24 hours to remove all materials from the site or face immediate fines and legal action. The notice also said the architectural committee had reviewed my application again and determined that my fence design violated Section 4.7 of the covenants regarding aesthetic consistency, a section that had never been mentioned before and was so vague it could mean anything. I printed the email, printed my approval letter, printed the survey report, and started building a tabbed binder with every document I had. I also called my real estate agent, a guy named Kevin, who had sold me the place and warned me during closing that Survey Ridge HOA had a reputation for aggressive enforcement. He told me that liens and disclosure issues could tank my resale value, and that I needed to fight this immediately, or it would follow me forever. The next morning, I went to the HOA management company office and requested a copy of the architectural committee meeting minutes where my fence was approved. The woman at the front desk said she would have to check with Martha because all architectural records go through her first. I told her that was fine, and I would wait. 20 minutes later, Martha walked in through the side door with her pink blazer and her label maker swinging from her bag, and she looked surprised to see me sitting there with my binder on my lap. She asked what I wanted, and I said I wanted the meeting minutes. She said the minutes are not public record and that I had no right to see them. I pointed out that I am a homeowner in the HOA and that the covenants give me the right to inspect association records with reasonable notice, and she said I did not give reasonable notice because I just showed up. I told her I was giving notice right now, and I would wait as long as it took. She stared at me for a long moment, then told the desk woman to print the minutes from the last architectural meeting. The minutes arrived 10 minutes later, and they were 1 page long. The page listed 3 applications, including mine, and next to my name it said approved pending setback verification. That phrase had never appeared in my approval letter, and I knew immediately that Martha had added it after the fact to create a loophole. I took a photo of the page with my phone and asked Martha what setback verification meant. She said it meant the committee had to verify that my survey was accurate before final approval could be granted, and since the survey was in dispute, the approval was not final. I asked who was disputing the survey, and she said she was, based on HOA records. I asked again to see the HOA records, and she refused again. She said the HOA did not have to share proprietary boundary data with residents and that I could wait for the hearing if I wanted to challenge it. Then she told me the hearing was scheduled for the following Thursday at 10 in the morning, which happened to be a time when I would be at work and could not attend without taking unpaid leave. I told her I could not make that time and asked if we could reschedule, and she said the board had already set the date, and if I did not show, they would proceed without me and vote to uphold the violation. That was when I realized the HOA method here was scheduling hearings at impossible times, so I would no-show and they could default vote me into compliance or fines. I told Martha I would be there, and I walked out with my binder under my arm and my phone recording the whole exchange in my pocket. The neighborhood around Survey Ridge HOA is the kind of place where the board calls everything a setback emergency, and you can feel the tension in the way people avoid eye contact when they see an HOA officer walking the streets. I drove home past rows of identical mailboxes and identical front yards, and I saw at least 3 houses with small violation notices taped to their garage doors. One notice was about a trash can left out past collection day. Another was about a garden hose visible from the street. The third was about a decorative wreath that exceeded the seasonal display window. It was the kind of enforcement culture that makes people afraid to do anything without checking the rulebook first, and I could see why Kevin had warned me. That afternoon, I called the surveyor who had done my property report and asked if he could come out again to verify the iron pins and take photos. He said he could come Monday, and that if the HOA was challenging his work, he would provide a notarized affidavit confirming his measurements. I also called a local attorney who handled HOA disputes, and she told me that if the HOA was misrepresenting an ordinance or faking meeting minutes, I could escalate to the state attorney general or file a complaint with the county. But that would take time and money I did not have. She said the faster route was to force the HOA to produce their boundary records at the hearing and challenge them on the spot. And if they could not produce anything credible, the board would have to back down or risk liability. I thanked her and hung up, then spent the rest of the weekend organizing my binder with tabs for the survey, the approval letter, the emails, the meeting minutes, and a blank section where I would add the surveyor affidavit once I had it. Monday morning, the surveyor came out with a tripod and a laser level and spent 2 hours rechecking every corner pin and photographing the string line layout. He confirmed that my stakes were exactly 2 feet 3 inches inside my property line, and that the fence alignment I had marked was fully compliant with the setback rule. He printed a 1-page affidavit on his company letterhead, signed it, and had me notarize it right there on the hood of his truck. He also gave me a USB drive with high-resolution photos of each corner pin and close-ups of the string line measurements. I added the affidavit to my binder and labeled the tab in thick black marker. That same afternoon, I got another email from the management company. This one was not a violation notice. It was a demand letter claiming that I had damaged HOA common property during the post-hole digging, and that I must pay $1,200 immediately for repair and restoration, or be charged $50 per day until the balance was paid. The letter included 3 photos that Martha had taken, showing dirt piles near the string line and a patch of dead grass that had supposedly been caused by my auger. I looked at the photos, and I could tell immediately that the dead grass patch was old, probably from dog urine or over-fertilizing, because the edges were brown and crispy in a way that does not happen from fresh digging. The dirt piles were real, but they were on my side of the property line, and I had every intention of cleaning them up once the fence work resumed. I replied to the email with a polite message saying I disputed the damage claim and that I would address it at the hearing. Within an hour, I got a response from Martha directly, not from the management company. The response said that if I disputed the claim, I was admitting I caused the damage, and that the daily charges would start immediately. It was nonsense logic, but it was clear that she was trying to stack financial pressure on me, so I would either pay up or give up. The charges were set to start the next day, which meant I had less than 24 hours to either pay or escalate. I did not pay. Instead, I sent a formal written objection to the management company, the board president, and the architectural committee, citing the surveyor affidavit and requesting an independent inspection of the so-called damage. I also sent a copy to Kevin, my real estate agent, because I wanted a witness outside the HOA structure who could confirm I was following proper procedure. That night, I could not sleep. I kept thinking about the cure deadline and the daily fines, and the fact that Martha had complete control over the hearing schedule and the agenda. I realized that even if I showed up with a perfect case, she could railroad the vote by controlling who was on the board and who got to speak. The HOA has 5 board members, and Martha is vice president, which means she has influence over at least 2 or 3 votes just by setting the narrative before the meeting. I needed something bigger than a surveyor affidavit. I needed something that would force the board to stop and reconsider before they voted, something that would make them afraid of liability. That something was already in my pocket, but I was not ready to play it yet. If you are enjoying this story, hit that like button and subscribe for more HOA drama where the paper trail wins. Tuesday morning, I woke up to a text message from an unknown number. The message said my contractor had been contacted by the HOA and told that if he resumed work on my property, he would be banned from all future projects in Survey Ridge and reported to the county licensing board for unpermitted work. I called the contractor immediately, and he confirmed it. He said Martha had called him directly, told him the fence project was under dispute, and said that any work he did before the hearing was resolved would be considered trespassing, and he would be held liable. He apologized and said he could not risk his license over a single job. I understood, but it left me in a bind because I had materials sitting in my yard and no way to finish the work even if I won the hearing. I asked if he would at least come back after the hearing if I got clearance, and he said maybe, but he sounded nervous. That same morning, I got another email from the management company with a revised hearing notice. The hearing time had been moved from 10 in the morning to 8:30 in the morning, a time that would require me to leave work even earlier and lose more pay. The notice also said that I was limited to 10 minutes of presentation time and that any documents I wanted to submit had to be provided to the board 72 hours in advance, which was now impossible because the hearing was only 2 days away. I replied immediately saying I had not received adequate notice for the document deadline and requesting an extension. The reply came back from Martha within minutes. She said the deadline was clearly stated in the bylaws and that my failure to read the bylaws was not the board's problem. She also reminded me that if I did not attend the hearing, the board would vote in my absence and the violation would stand. The daily fines would start Thursday night at midnight if the violation was upheld, which gave me less than 72 hours to either win or face escalating costs that would bankrupt me in a month. I went to work that day with my binder in my truck and my phone recording every call, and I spent my lunch break calling the county planning office to verify the fence permit and setback rules. The planning clerk confirmed that my permit was valid, that the city had no issue with my fence design, and that the HOA could not override city code as long as I stayed within the legal limits. I asked if the county had any record of Survey Ridge HOA challenging property boundaries or filing disputes, and the clerk said there was nothing on file. That was a key piece of information, because it meant Martha's claim about HOA boundary records was unsupported by any official documentation. I asked the clerk if she could provide a written statement confirming that the city had no record of HOA boundary disputes, and she said she could email me a basic records search result. I gave her my email, and she sent it within an hour. The email was short and plain, but it was exactly what I needed. It said the city planning office has no record of boundary disputes filed by Survey Ridge HOA Incorporated regarding the property at my address, and it was signed by the clerk with a date stamp. I printed it, added it to my binder, and labeled the tab City Records. That afternoon, my neighbor from 2 doors down, a guy named Derek, who I had only met once, knocked on my door while he was watering his lawn. He said he had seen Martha out taking photos of my yard earlier in the day, and that she had been walking around with a tape measure and her label maker, stopping every few feet to type notes. He said it looked like she was building a case, and that I should be careful because she had done the same thing to another neighbor last year over a shed placement. The other neighbor had ended up paying a fine and moving the shed even though he had a permit, because the HOA threatened to put a lien on his house and he could not afford to fight it. Derek said he did not trust the board and that if I needed a witness at the hearing he would come. I thanked him and told him I might take him up on that. Derek walked back to his yard and resumed watering, and I stood there watching him and thinking about how many other people in this neighborhood had been bullied into compliance by Martha and the board. That night, I did something I had been planning since the first violation notice. I called the phone number on the back of Martha's violation notice, the one listed for HOA enforcement, and I left a calm, polite voicemail saying I wanted to discuss the fence issue before the hearing and see if we could resolve it without a formal vote. I knew she would not call back, but I wanted the message on record showing I had tried to de-escalate. She did not call back. Instead, I got a third email from the management company Wednesday morning with a new attachment. The attachment was a photo that Martha had taken showing my string line pulled tight between two stakes, and in the photo the string line was sagging slightly in the middle, which made it look like it was bowing out over the property line. The email claimed the sag proved that my layout was inaccurate and that I needed to restake and resurvey before any work could proceed. I looked at the photo carefully, and I could see that it had been taken from a low angle to exaggerate the sag, and I knew the sag was just gravity and wind, because string line always sags a little over long distances unless you use a tensioning reel. I also knew that the sag did not matter, because the stakes themselves were placed based on the surveyor's measurements, not the string. But the photo was a clever move, because it looked bad to anyone who did not understand how layout works, and I could see how Martha would use it at the hearing to argue that my measurements were sloppy. I took my own photos that afternoon, showing the stakes from multiple angles and showing the string line pulled taut, and I added them to my binder under a new tab labeled Rebuttal Photos. Wednesday afternoon, I got a call from Kevin, my real estate agent. He said he had heard from another agent in the area that Martha was telling people I was a problem resident who refused to follow rules, and that the word was spreading through the local real estate network. Kevin said that kind of reputation could make it hard to sell the house later if I decided to move, and that I needed to shut it down fast, or it would stick. He offered to write a letter to the board on my behalf, vouching for my character and explaining that I had followed all proper procedures, and I told him to go ahead. He sent the letter that evening and copied me on it. The letter was professional and factual, and it pointed out that I had submitted all required documents, obtained city permits, and hired a licensed surveyor, and that any claims to the contrary were inaccurate. It also noted that liens and unresolved disputes would affect the property's marketability, and that the board had a fiduciary duty to avoid actions that could harm property values. The letter was exactly the kind of outside pressure I needed, because it reminded the board that their decisions had legal and financial consequences beyond just me. That night, I reviewed my binder one more time and made sure every tab was in order. I had the survey, the approval letter, the meeting minutes, the surveyor affidavit, the city record search, the rebuttal photos, and Kevin's letter. I also had my phone ready to record the hearing audio, because I knew from experience that meetings like this often go off the rails, and having a recording can be the difference between winning and losing. I went to bed early and set 3 alarms for Thursday morning. The hearing was at 8:30 and I wanted to be there by 8:15 so I could see who else showed up and get a sense of the room. I also wanted to be the first one seated, so Martha could not control where I sat or try to position herself as the authority figure at the head of the table. Thursday morning, I woke up at 6, showered, put on a clean work shirt, and loaded my binder and my phone into my truck. I stopped for coffee on the way to the management company office, and I sat in the parking lot for 10 minutes, reviewing my notes and making sure my phone was charged and recording. At 8:20, I walked into the lobby and found the hearing room. It was a small conference room with a rectangular table and 8 chairs. 3 board members were already seated, including Martha, and the board president was standing near the door talking to the management company rep. Derek, my neighbor, was sitting in a chair against the wall near the back, and he gave me a nod when I walked in. I took a seat at the table across from Martha and set my binder down with the cover facing her so she could see the tabs. She looked at the binder and her face tightened, but she did not say anything. The board president called the meeting to order at 8:30 and read the agenda. My fence violation was the only item on the list. He asked me to present my case and said I had 10 minutes. I stood up, opened my binder, and started walking through the documents one by one. I showed the approval letter with the date stamp and the signature from the architectural committee. I showed the survey report with the iron pins marked and the setback distances calculated. I showed the surveyor affidavit confirming the measurements. I showed the city records search proving there were no HOA boundary disputes on file. I showed the rebuttal photos proving my string line layout was accurate. I kept my voice calm and factual, and I made eye contact with each board member as I spoke. When I finished, I had used 8 minutes and 30 seconds. The board president thanked me and asked if anyone had questions. One of the other board members, a woman I had never met, asked if I had submitted the documents 72 hours in advance. I said I had not because the revised hearing notice had been sent too late for me to meet the deadline, and I pointed out that I had requested an extension and been denied. The board president looked at Martha and asked if that was correct. Martha said the deadline was clearly stated in the bylaws and that I should have known. The board president frowned, but did not push it. Then, Martha spoke. She said the documents I had presented were insufficient because they did not address the aesthetic consistency issue raised in the violation notice, and she said the surveyor affidavit was just one person's opinion and did not override the HOA's right to enforce its own standards. She said the board had a duty to protect property values and that my fence design, even if technically compliant with setback rules, was not consistent with the neighborhood character. She pulled out her phone and started showing photos of other fences in the neighborhood, claiming they were all shorter or less visible than mine. I watched her scroll through the photos and I realized she was trying to shift the argument away from the property line issue and onto subjective aesthetics, because she knew she had no case on the boundary dispute. That was when I decided to play my trump card. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone, opened the voice memo app, and played the recording I had made on Monday when Martha called my contractor. The recording was clear. You could hear Martha's voice saying that if the contractor resumed work, he would be banned from future projects and reported to the licensing board. And you could hear the contractor asking if the ban was official board policy or just her personal opinion. And you could hear Martha say it was her decision as vice president and that the board would back her up. The room went silent. The board president looked at Martha and asked if she had made that call. Martha said she had, but that it was within her authority to protect the HOA from liability. The board president said it was not within her authority to threaten contractors without a board vote, and that she had exposed the HOA to a potential tortious interference claim. The other board members shifted in their seats, and one of them asked if the management company had been informed of the call. The management rep said she had not. I let the silence hang for a moment. Then I said I had submitted the packet to the HOA attorney earlier that morning, and that I was waiting to hear back about next steps. That was not entirely true. I had not submitted anything yet, but I wanted Martha to think the attorney was already involved, so she would back down. The board president looked at me and asked what I wanted. I said I wanted the violation rescinded, the fines canceled, and a written apology confirming that my fence project was approved and compliant. I also said I wanted the board to revise the hearing procedures so that residents could not be railroaded with impossible deadlines and last-minute schedule changes. The board president looked at Martha and said they would take a recess to discuss. Martha stood up and walked out of the room without looking at me, and the other board members followed. I sat down and waited. Derek leaned forward from his chair against the wall and said that was the most satisfying thing he had seen all year. I nodded and tried to keep my face neutral, but inside I was shaking with adrenaline. 10 minutes later, the board president came back into the room alone. He said the board had voted to rescind the violation and cancel the fines, and that I was cleared to resume the fence project as originally approved. He said the board would send a written confirmation within 24 hours, and that the management company would update my account to reflect the decision. He also said the board would review the hearing procedures at the next meeting and consider changes to the document deadline rule. He did not mention the apology, and I did not push it because I had won the important parts. I thanked him, packed up my binder, and walked out. Martha was standing in the parking lot next to her car with her phone pressed to her ear, and she glared at me as I walked past. I did not say anything. I just got in my truck and drove home. That afternoon, I called my contractor and told him the violation had been rescinded and that he was clear to resume work. He said he would come out the next morning and finish the post holes. I also called Kevin and told him the outcome, and he said he would follow up with the other agents to correct the reputation damage Martha had been spreading. The written confirmation arrived Friday morning by email. It was a short letter from the board president saying the violation had been rescinded and that I was in full compliance with all HOA rules. It did not mention Martha or the contractor call, but it was signed by the president and dated, which was enough for me to file away as proof. The contractor showed up Friday at 9, and we finished the post holes by noon. The fence panels went up over the weekend, and by Sunday evening I had a fully installed cedar fence that was 5 feet 11 inches tall, set back 2 feet 3 inches from the property line, and absolutely beautiful. I took photos of the finished work and sent them to the surveyor and Kevin, and I added copies to my binder under a new tab labeled Completion. Monday morning, I got another email from the management company, and for a split second I thought it was another violation notice. Instead, it was a notice about a special board meeting scheduled for the following Thursday to discuss revisions to the architectural hearing process. The notice said the board was proposing new rules that would require at least 7 days' notice for document submissions and would allow residents to request alternate hearing dates if the scheduled time conflicted with work or medical appointments. It also said the board was adopting a policy that prohibited individual board members from contacting contractors or vendors on behalf of the HOA without prior board approval. I read the notice twice and realized it was exactly the outcome I had pushed for. The HOA was changing hearing rules so residents could not be railroaded, and Martha's power to intimidate contractors had been officially curtailed. The notice was proof that the system could be forced to change if you fought back with documentation and persistence. I forwarded the notice to Derek and Kevin, and I added it to my binder under a tab labeled Victory. That Thursday, I attended the special board meeting to watch the vote. The meeting room was packed with residents who had heard about the hearing rule changes, and I recognized a few faces from around the neighborhood who had their own stories about being fined or threatened over minor violations. The board president presented the proposed changes and opened the floor for comments. One resident stood up and said the old hearing process had been used to bully people into paying fines they did not owe, and that the new rules were long overdue. Another resident said the contractor intimidation policy should apply to all board members, not just vice presidents, because the problem was not unique to Martha. The board president agreed and added an amendment to make the policy apply to all officers and committee members. The vote was unanimous. The new hearing rules passed, the contractor intimidation policy passed, and the board also voted to require an independent review of any violation that involved a boundary dispute or survey challenge. The changes would take effect immediately. Martha sat at the far end of the table during the vote, with her arms crossed and her face blank, and she did not say a word. After the meeting, I walked out into the parking lot and found Derek waiting by his car. He said he was glad I had fought back because it had opened the door for other people to speak up, and that the neighborhood felt different now. He said a few other residents were planning to run for board seats in the next election to push out the old guard, and he asked if I would consider running. I told him I would think about it, but honestly, I just wanted to move on and enjoy my new fence. I drove home and spent the rest of the evening grilling in my backyard, and for the first time since I moved in, I felt like the place was actually mine. The following week, I got a call from the HOA attorney. She said she had received a complaint from Martha, claiming that I had defamed her during the hearing by playing the contractor call recording without her consent, and that she was threatening to sue me for invasion of privacy. The attorney said the claim was frivolous because New York is a one-party consent state, and I had every right to record the call, and that Martha had no case. She also said the board had asked her to review all of Martha's enforcement actions over the past year to see if there were other instances of overreach or contractor intimidation, and that the review was ongoing. I thanked the attorney and hung up, and I added a note to my binder about the call. A few days later, I got a text from Derek. He said Martha had resigned from the board effective immediately, citing personal reasons. The text included a screenshot of the resignation email, which was short and cold and gave no details. Derek said the board had already appointed an interim vice president, and that the new person was a retired accountant who had no history of aggressive enforcement. I read the text and felt a wave of relief. Martha was gone, the hearing rules had been changed, and the contractor intimidation policy was in place. The HOA had been forced to clean up its act, and I had my fence. 2 weeks later, I was in my front yard watering the lawn when I saw Martha drive past in her car. She slowed down as she passed my house and stared at the fence for a long moment, then sped up and kept going. I did not wave. I just kept watering and watched her disappear around the corner. That was the last time I saw her. Over the next few months, I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that Martha had moved out of Survey Ridge and bought a condo in another part of Albany. Derek said she had listed her house quietly and sold it within 2 weeks, probably because she did not want to deal with the fallout from her resignation and the board investigation. I did not feel bad for her. She had chosen to use her position to bully people, and when she got caught, she could not handle the consequences. The board investigation wrapped up in early summer, and the results were shared at a community meeting. The attorney had found 3 other cases where Martha had threatened contractors or vendors without board approval, and 2 cases where she had misrepresented HOA rules to pressure residents into paying fines. The board issued a formal apology to the affected residents and refunded the fines that had been collected under false pretenses. The apology letter also included a statement saying the board was committed to transparency and fair enforcement going forward, and that any future violations of the contractor intimidation policy would result in immediate removal from the board. I kept a copy of the apology letter in my binder, right next to the Victory tab. The fence held up perfectly through the summer and fall. No violations, no complaints, no surprise inspections. I got compliments from neighbors who said it looked clean and professional, and one guy even asked for my contractor's number so he could install a similar fence in his own yard. The contractor came back and did 2 more jobs in Survey Ridge that season, and he told me he appreciated that I had stood up to Martha because it had cleared the way for him to work in the neighborhood again without fear of retaliation. I told him he was welcome and that I was glad it worked out. In the fall, I attended my first HOA annual meeting as a regular resident, not as someone fighting a violation. The meeting was calmer than I expected. The new vice president gave a budget report and answered questions about upcoming maintenance projects. And the board president talked about the hearing rule changes and the contractor policy, and said the feedback from residents had been overwhelmingly positive. One resident stood up and thanked the board for making the changes, and said it felt like the HOA was finally working for the community instead of against it. The room applauded, and I joined in. After the meeting, I talked to a few neighbors I had not met before, and they told me their own stories about dealing with Martha and the old enforcement culture. One woman said Martha had fined her $300 for having a garden gnome in her front yard because it was not on the approved decorations list. Another guy said Martha had threatened to tow his work van every day for a week until he started parking it in his garage instead of the driveway. The stories were all similar. Martha had used her position to enforce petty rules with maximum aggression, and when people pushed back, she escalated until they gave up. I was glad I had not given up, because it had broken the pattern and forced the board to change. That winter, I ran into Kevin at a hardware store, and he told me the real estate market in Survey Ridge had improved slightly since the board changes, because buyers were less scared of getting hit with surprise fines and enforcement actions. He said a few agents were even using the new hearing rules as a selling point, framing Survey Ridge as an HOA that had reformed and learned from its mistakes. I laughed and said that was a generous way to describe it, but I was glad the changes were having a positive effect. Kevin said he had recommended me to a few other clients who were dealing with HOA disputes, and that my story had become a cautionary tale for boards across the region about what happens when you let one officer run enforcement like a personal fiefdom. I told him I was happy to help if anyone needed advice, and we shook hands and went our separate ways. In the spring, I decided to run for a board seat in the next election. Derek had been asking me for months, and I figured it was time to get involved and make sure the new policies stuck. I filed my candidacy paperwork with the management company in March and started campaigning by talking to neighbors and attending committee meetings. My platform was simple: transparency, fair enforcement, and no more railroading. I did not mention Martha by name, but everyone knew what I was talking about. The election was held in May, and I won by a comfortable margin. I joined the board as a regular member, not an officer, and my first priority was to make sure the hearing rules and contractor policy were being followed. I also pushed for a new rule that required the board to publish all violation notices and hearing results on the HOA website so residents could see what was being enforced and how, and the board agreed. The website went live in June, and it immediately made the enforcement process more transparent and harder to abuse. I also worked with the management company to create a simple flowchart for residents to follow if they got a violation notice. with clear steps for requesting a hearing, submitting evidence, and appealing a decision. The flowchart was printed on a laminated card and mailed to every household in Survey Ridge, and the feedback was positive. People felt like they finally had a roadmap for dealing with the HOA, instead of just guessing and hoping for the best. By the end of my first year on the board, I had helped pass 3 new policies, attended every committee meeting, and personally reviewed a dozen violation cases to make sure they were being handled fairly. I never saw Martha again, but I heard she had moved to Florida and bought a place in a gated community with even stricter rules than Survey Ridge. I wished her neighbors luck. As for me, I kept my fence in perfect condition, kept my binder updated with every board meeting minute and policy change, and kept showing up to make sure the HOA stayed accountable. It was not the retirement project I had imagined when I moved in, but it was worth it. The neighborhood was calmer, the board was fairer, and the residents were not afraid anymore. That was the real victory, bigger than any single fence or violation fight. It was proof that you can fight back against HOA overreach and win, as long as you stay documented, stay patient, and refuse to back down when someone tries to bully you into submission. The fence still stands today, 5 feet 11 inches of cedar perfection, exactly where the survey said it should be. Every time I walk past it, I think about the string line fluttering in the wind and Martha screaming that movement proved my fence was unsafe. And I think about how close I came to giving up and just paying the fines to make it go away. I am glad I did not. I am glad I built the binder and gathered the evidence and played the trump card at exactly the right moment. I am glad Derek showed up as a witness and Kevin wrote the letter and the surveyor came back to verify the pins. I am glad the board was forced to change the rules and Martha was forced out and the neighborhood got a second chance to do things right. Most of all, I am glad I documented everything, because in the end, that is what saved me. The paper trail, the recordings, the photos, the affidavits, the city records search, all of it combined into a case so airtight that the board had no choice but to back down. That is the lesson I carry forward now as a board member myself. Documentation is power, and transparency is the only thing that keeps an HOA honest. If you are reading this, and you are fighting your own HOA battle, here is my advice. Keep records of every email, every phone call, every meeting, every conversation. Take photos, take videos, get witnesses, get affidavits. Know your state laws about recording and consent. Know your HOA covenants and bylaws backward and forward so you can catch them when they lie or make things up. Do not be afraid to escalate to an attorney or a government agency if the HOA is breaking the law or violating your rights. Do not back down just because they threaten fines or liens or foreclosure. Most of the time, those threats are bluffs designed to make you quit, and if you call the bluff with evidence, they will fold. And if you have a trump card, a piece of evidence or a recording or a document that you know will flip the case in your favor, do not play it too early. Wait until the hearing or the meeting or the showdown, and then deploy it when everyone is watching and the board cannot bury it or ignore it. That is what I did, and it worked. The call recording where Martha threatened my contractor was the trump card that changed everything, and I held it until the exact right moment when the board president was in the room and the other board members were listening, and there was no way for Martha to spin it or deny it. That recording, combined with the surveyor affidavit and the city records search and Kevin's letter, created a documented appeal that overturned the decision on the record and forced the HOA to admit they were wrong. That is the formula. Evidence plus timing plus witnesses equals victory. It is not fast, and it is not easy, but it works. And when it works, it feels better than anything. I look at my fence every day and I remember the fight. And I remember that I won because I refused to let Martha and the board railroad me into giving up. That refusal is what changed the HOA. And it is what protects the next person who moves into Survey Ridge and gets hit with a bogus violation. The hearing rules are better now, the contractor policy is in place, and the board knows that residents are watching and will fight back if they try to abuse their power again. That is the legacy of my fence. Not just the wood and the posts and the pickets, but the policy changes and the accountability and the message that you cannot bully people into compliance if they are willing to document everything and stand their ground. Martha learned that lesson the hard way when her staged photos got used against her, and the board was forced to investigate her enforcement record. The HOA learned it when they had to change hearing rules so residents cannot be railroaded and adopt a contractor intimidation policy to prevent future abuse. And I learned it when I realized that the only way to win against an HOA is to beat them at their own game, using their own rules and procedures and documentation standards to prove they are wrong. That is what I did, and that is what you can do too, if you are willing to put in the work and refuse to quit. The fight is worth it. The fence is worth it. The victory is worth it. And the knowledge that you stood up for yourself and forced a corrupt system to change is worth more than any fine or fee or hearing outcome. That is the real payoff. And it is why I keep my binder updated and my recording app ready and my eyes open for the next Martha who tries to use her position to push people around. Because now I know how to fight back, and I know how to win, and I am not going anywhere. The last thing I will say is this. If you are dealing with an HOA Karen or an HOA board that has gone rogue, do not assume you are powerless. You are not. You have rights under your state laws, under your HOA covenants, and under basic fairness principles that even the most aggressive board cannot ignore if you force them to follow their own rules. You have the right to see records, to request hearings, to submit evidence, to appeal decisions, and to escalate to outside authorities if the HOA breaks the law. You have the right to record conversations if your state allows it, to hire attorneys if you need legal advice, and to organize with other residents if the board is abusing its power. Most importantly, you have the right to fight back and win, as long as you stay within the law and stay focused on documentation and evidence. That is what I did, and that is why I am sitting here today with a beautiful fence and a seat on the board and a neighborhood that is finally working the way it should. The fight changed me, and it changed Survey Ridge, and I hope it changes you too if you are reading this and wondering whether it is worth it to stand up to your HOA. It is worth it. Every time. The funny karma beat that made it all worth it was when Martha repeated her threat about banning my contractor, and everyone heard it on the recording, and she had no way to take it back or deny it, because the audio was crystal clear and time-stamped and saved on 3 separate devices. That moment, when the board president asked if she had made the call and she had to admit it, was the moment the power shifted and the fight became winnable. That is the moment you are working toward when you document everything, and when it comes, you will know it. Because the whole room will shift, and the board will realize they cannot bluff their way out of it anymore. That is the moment that makes all the stress and sleepless nights and binder organizing worth it. That is the moment you win. Stay calm, stay documented, and I will see you next time.